Very glad to be able to have the opportunity to share tonight with you guys. We're going to be talking about one of the parables of Jesus in the Gospels. And if you guys are ready, well, let's turn to Luke chapter 14. Because in Luke chapter 14, I think we find maybe one of the most pointed places where Jesus addresses what it means to follow him, to be a follower of Jesus, which he uses the term a disciple. And that's what a disciple is. A disciple is one who is taught by another, who learns from another, and there's a teacher, like a mentor, and then there's a pupil. And the disciple is the pupil being taught by the teacher, the mentor. So here in Luke chapter 14, now Luke 14 is it's part of a long series of episodes in Jesus's life here that are kind of like toward the end, because back in Luke chapter 9, he talks about his upcoming death, and he then says that in Luke chapter 9 that he sets his face then to go to Jerusalem, because he knows that's where his destiny is. He has to go to Jerusalem in order for all this prophecy to be fulfilled about him. So from Luke 9 on through and into here in Luke 14, he's in this process of traveling, and he travels from up in the north and then in the Galilee area, and then travels into the area of Samaria. And then it says that he stops by the house of Martha and Mary, which I think that is might be Luke chapter 10, end of Luke chapter 10. And we know that Martha and Mary are in the city of Bethany. And Bethany is right next door to Jerusalem. It's only a couple miles away. So he's made his way there, almost entirely. And previously in Luke chapter 14, Jesus is eating with these other Pharisees, and he talks with them about the kingdom of God, and he basically says that there's going to be room in the kingdom for people besides the Pharisees and the religious leaders. And he challenges them and talks about the great banquet in the kingdom. And then after this, he leaves. And we get this record here in verse 25. It says in verse 25, excuse me, now large crowds were traveling with him. And he turned and said to them, so he's left Bethany, obviously. He's not in the town. He's traveling outside the town, and he just has these crowds traveling with him. And he just turns around and decides to tell them this information, this sort of like this challenge, and then he follows up with a little mini parable. He says, whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Let me stop for a second and try to process that statement by Jesus. Anyone who comes to me and doesn't fulfill these criteria, they don't hate all of their family members, and they don't hate even their own life, he says, they cannot be my disciple. Wow. What is Jesus trying to say? Is he really like anti-family? Is he saying that it's all me and nothing else, and you just got to cut ties with everybody? You got to move out into some desert place somewhere and live all by yourself with me? That's not quite it. I want to shed some light on the meaning of what Jesus is trying to say here. But before I build a little biblical case for it, I can say that the parallel passage in Matthew chapter 10, which if you guys just want to turn there real quick, it's in Matthew chapter 10. I think it's 37. Yes. So Matthew chapter 10, verse 37, Jesus gives a similar statement, but he phrases it in an affirmation type of way rather than negation. So he says, whoever loves his father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever loves his son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. So we're talking about love and hate. And in the Bible, love and hate are oftentimes used in an emotive sense, like an affective sense, like somebody has emotional love or emotional hate. But there's also a very common Hebrew idiom where the terms love and hate are used to describe a disposition of one's attitude or their basis of choice. And we can see this, I think, through the record, a really good record in the book of Genesis. So if you guys want to turn, we're going to go to Genesis chapter 29. And I think we're going to read a record here that most of us are probably familiar with, but I'm going to draw our attention to how it relates to Jesus' statement in Luke 14. We're going to pick up the record, I would say, in verse 13. So Genesis 29, verse 13, it came to pass when Laban heard the news of Jacob, his sister's son, that he ran to meet Jacob and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. Jacob told Laban all these things. Laban said to him, surely you are my bone and my flesh. He lived with him for a month. Laban said to Jacob, because you are my brother, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what will your wages be? Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful in form and attractive. Jacob loved Rachel. He said, I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. Laban said, it is better that I give her to you than that I should give her to another man. Stay with me. Jacob served 7 years for Rachel. They seemed to him but a few days for the love he had for her. Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, that I may go in to her. Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a feast. It came to pass in the evening that he took Leah his daughter and brought her to him, and he went into her. Laban gave Zilpah his slave to his daughter Leah for a slave. But in the morning, behold, it was Leah. He said to Laban, what is this you have done to me? Did I not serve you for Rachel? Or did I not serve with you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me? Laban said, it is not done so in our place to give the younger before the firstborn. Fulfill the weeks of this one, and we will give you the other one also for the service that you will serve with me yet 7 other years. Jacob did so and fulfilled her week. He gave him Rachel his daughter as wife. Laban gave Bilhah his slave to his daughter Rachel to be her slave. He went in also to Rachel, and he loved also Rachel more than Leah, and served with him yet 7 other years. Verse 31, Yahweh saw that Leah was hated, and he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. This whole record is showing a difference in love for Rachel. And then ultimately, as we find out, what Yahweh saw was that Leah was hated. Now, in the biblical culture, when I was saying that there's like a Hebraism where hate and love are talking about a disposition towards something or a preference or choice, that's exactly what's going on here. It's not that Jacob actually had this vehement abhorrence for Leah, as though he couldn't even stand her or something. It was that he preferred Rachel. And that's what I think he says in verse 30, that he loved Rachel more than Leah. So Leah was not his preferred choice of wife. She kind of got thrown in with the lot, sort of at her father's whim of a way to have her get married and be provided for. So he sort of snookered Jacob into marrying Leah first. But basically, Jacob prefers Rachel over Leah. And there's one more place where this is evident in the New Testament. In Romans chapter 9, Paul is writing a lot about the way that God has dealt historically with his people, Israel, and the ways that his plan of redemption has been unfolding through them particularly. And in let's just start in verse 12, Romans chapter 9, verse 12. It says, "It was said to her," which maybe we should move back a little bit more in context. Let's go back to verse 10. So there's a promise for Sarah to have a son, and verse 10, "And not only her, but Rebekah also, when she conceived twins by one man, our father Isaac." So Isaac and Rebekah had Jacob and Esau. Those are the twins. "For though they were not yet born and had not made a practice of doing anything good or evil, so that God's purpose according to his choice would stand, not because of works, but because of him who calls, it was said to her," so this was spoken to Rebekah, "the older will serve the younger, as it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated." Now, God doesn't have this actual emotional hatred for Esau, especially when Esau was not even born yet. He was an unborn baby in the womb of Rebekah with his twin brother Jacob. So even before they were born, God made a preference. He made a choice according to his own will and purposes for how he was executing the plan of redemption to work through Jacob and ultimately his descendants, which would form the nation of Israel. That was his sovereign prerogative. And he made that choice. And that is reflected in the language that he loved Jacob and he hated Esau. Simply just a matter of he chose to use Jacob for his redemptive purposes and not Esau. So let's go back then to Luke 14. So when Jesus is saying, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, yes, even life, even their life, their own life, whoever doesn't hate these things can't be my disciple," what he's saying is, if you give preference to these things over me, I mean, he's really talking about a matter of allegiance here. He's saying if you are more loyal to your family members, or if you're more loyal to your own personal life and desires, you can't be my disciple. Essentially, for discipleship in Jesus's eyes, Jesus comes first. There can't be anything above Jesus if you're going to be his disciple. But that doesn't mean that you can't have any other things and Jesus. I think that's sometimes what people they get caught up on, is they think that it's only Jesus and nothing else. And that's not Jesus's point here. It's just Jesus's numero uno, and nothing can come before him. And I think verse 27 pairs nicely with that, where he continues on, "Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple." Now, this here, carrying the cross, nobody's walking around with a big wooden, beam on their back. The cross is a metaphor. And what Jesus is trying to say is that those who are ashamed to identify with me, and those who are not going to persevere through the trials of life like he did through the crucifixion, and that they're not able to be his disciples, that in order to be Jesus's disciple, we have to self-identify with Jesus. And that's part of, we're carrying the cross. We're carrying the cross, meaning we're facing the trials of life. We're willing to identify in the humility of Jesus. We're willing to be mocked and scorned by the world for Jesus. I mean, Jesus told his disciples that the world is going to hate you. And it's not because of you, it's because of me. they hated me first, and because they hate me, they're going to hate you too. And so willingly embracing that, bearing that cross every day, that is self-identifying with Jesus as your Lord. And when we identify Jesus as our Lord, that means we're willing to follow him wherever he leads us. Not afraid to bear the cross, whatever that burden looks like. Following Jesus as his disciple is about a fearless trust in Jesus as our Lord. Now, Jesus works to make the point about the significance and the weight, you could say, gravity of these statements with these mini parables. Let's just take, there's two of them, so let's take one after the other. First one in verse 28, he says, okay, so given those stipulations that I just gave you guys, verse 28, Jesus says, for which of you intending to build a tower does not first sit down and estimate the cost to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it will begin to ridicule him, saying, this fellow began to build and was not able to, is not able to finish. When I think about building and construction and how much effort goes into some of the things that have been constructed around the world, my mind tends to always go to one particular building that I was just completely amazed by. And you guys may recognize this structure. It's a very famous building. Do you guys all see my slide? Yeah, this is the Burj Khalifa. This is the tallest building in the world. It's over in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, and it is just an impressive structure, to say the least. It's 2,700 some feet tall. It's 162 stories. That's how big the building is. 162 places that you can get off the elevator. It was constructed in 2010. Now, when you're building something this tall and this big, there's so many environmental factors you have to think about. I mean, I learned about a new one. It's called the stack effect. So you'd think okay, well, what about earthquakes? All right, and what about wind and these other geological versus and physical matters? But the stack effect happens in very tall buildings where there's a disproportionate temperature that causes pressure gradients within the building. And it can actually prevent doors and windows from opening because of negative pressures inside the building. Even elevator doors won't even open if the pressure gradient, I think, is above a certain level. So when I read about when they were building this building, they went through over 40 tests just for the wind shear alone on the outside of the building, and they tested it incrementally as they were building it too, to make sure that it was up to spec and there wasn't anything dangerous going to happen after they finished it. And they ran several climate models and pressure tests to reduce all stacking effects. And they actually did special studies to determine what type of changes would undergo in the building as it aged. Because if you build something this big, which let me think, it was, I tried to look up the cost. It was some $1 billion or $2 billion. I forget how many $1 billion it was, but it's an expensive building. And if you build a building this expensive and this grand, you kind of want it to last for a long time. It would be pretty bad if the building would collapse due to some malfunction or faulty construction. So there's other buildings. I like the way Jesus said, if you start building something, you need to have the foresight to know that you're going to be able to finish it. There's this is just a comparative graph to show you the height of the Burj Khalifa. in comparison to some of these other tall buildings. There's another building that's actually it was being built. It started in 2013, but actually it stopped in 2018, called the Jeddah Tower. That's supposed to exceed the Burj Khalifa, but actually it hasn't been worked on since 2018. They started building it for 5 years, and then they couldn't continue building it. Now, a lot of that was due to some political issues where one of the main benefactors actually had a lot of his assets seized. So I suppose there's a couple factors there that maybe were outside of the control of the builder, but nonetheless, it's incomplete at this time. And there's a number of these buildings here. This is an older chart from 2014, but there's a whole bunch of really tall buildings in the world that have just never been completed and are just sitting out there. Either their foundation is just sitting there, or they have some of the pilings built for the to do the walls, or they've actually worked on framing the building. It's at a bunch of different stages, but when you can't finish building what you set out to build, it's easy to kind of be mocked. And that's Jesus' point, that if you say you're going to do something and you don't really realize what it takes, you look like the fool. So when it comes to following Jesus, when it comes to giving your allegiance to Jesus, know what it takes. Don't be a fool. Don't be fooled by how much it's going to require to be a follower of Jesus. Now, his second parable, in verse 31, he says, "Or what king going out to wage a war against another king will not sit down first and consider whether he's able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If he cannot, then while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for the terms of peace." Now, it's no longer construction. It's not a construction metaphor or parable. It's now one that deals with warfare. It's militaristic. And if a king or a commander has an inferior army, you better have a very good battle strategy in order to go up against a superior force. Otherwise, sheer numbers will usually determine the victor. And one of the best examples, I think, in history of this is an ancient battle. And I bet most of you probably also know about this battle as well. It's called the Battle of Thermopylae. It's an ancient Greek battle waged in the 5th century BC over in Greece. And this was where a small group of soldiers, mostly a lot of them were made of Spartans, but there were some other nationalities in there as well. Probably the historians think around 7,000 total soldiers went up against the invading Persian army. Now, this is the army led by King Xerxes, and King Xerxes, his father, Darius, had long wanted to take the city of Athens. And so he never got to, but his son, Xerxes, he spent several years collecting resources and then launched this massive military campaign to march down, and they wanted to take Athens. Well, they catch the Spartans and the other soldiers. They catch the Persians at Thermopylae, which is a very unique place because there's mountains all through that region except along the coast. And there's a small little band, a path where you can travel along the coast in order to come down to Athens. So the Spartans knew this. This was their battle strategy. And so they decided to bottleneck the Persians there at Thermopylae. And they fought for 2 days, and because of the bottleneck, the Persian soldiers couldn't overrun the Greeks, the Spartans, and the others, because it's only so much width. I think it was something like could be as narrow as 50 feet at places. So it was real tight, and this gave the Spartans and the Greeks the advantage. Well, they fought for 2 days, but they got betrayed by a local Greek who told the Persians about another access path by which they could go around Thermopylae and get past the Spartans and the Greeks there. So King Leonidas dismissed the troops, and in what some of the ancient writers say 300 Spartans remained behind. There's actually various numbers that are given, but for the sake of the movie, 300, let's say 300 warriors stay behind. And they held off the Persians at Thermopylae and fought to the death. So unfortunately, they didn't send a delegation to Xerxes to try to make peace, terms of peace or not. They just decided to fight and protect the rest of the southern portion of the country there, down toward Athens. All right. Lastly, the last part of this whole section, in verse 33, says, "So therefore, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions." Okay, that one might hurt the most. Give up all you got. All my books, gone. Give up your home, give up your car, give up your clothing. Like, where's the extent to which this applies? Well, there are some places in the New Testament, like in the book of Acts, where we do see a lot of people sharing of their stuff. But there's no other real place in Scripture where people are told to literally own nothing. Now, it's true also that some of Jesus' disciples, at least his early disciples, they literally left what they were doing immediately, like Peter and James and Andrew and John, and they literally left what they were doing and they followed Jesus with nothing. But in Jesus's context here, it's not about owning nothing. It's about what owns you. And if there are things in your life that you have attachment to, whatever it is that you have attachment to that would rival your love and your allegiance for Jesus, that's what he's addressing. If you own things, materialistic possessions that you care for and couldn't do without, he's saying you need to get rid of those. Because if there's anything in your life that takes place, that has a place in your heart that would detract from you following me, that's got to go. You can't have family ahead of me. You can't put yourself ahead of me. You can't put things ahead of me. I have to be in the first place above all. So that's what I had to share about discipleship from Jesus's parables tonight. Like I said, I think this is probably one of his most pointed places where he literally just spells it out, point blank, challenges the reader to consider the cost. What does it take to be my disciple?